People always talk about the, end quote, American dream, end quote, like it's just a house with a white picket fence and a manicured lawn, but nobody ever tells you about the nightmares that come hidden in the fine print of those HOA bylaws, or the kind of people who treat a suburban cul-de-sac like it's their own private kingdom. My name's Elias Thorne, and for 25 years, I wore a badge in one of the toughest districts in the state, dealing with the kind of chaos that would make most people's skin crawl. So when I finally decided to hang up the uniform, well, mostly since I had just accepted a commander position at the local precinct, I thought I had earned a little slice of heaven in a place called Oak Crest Manor. It was supposed to be my fresh start, a place where the only thing I had to worry about was which color of mulch to use after losing my wife, Clara, to a long battle with illness 2 years ago. But life has a funny way of reminding you that prejudice doesn't in oppose. Care about your rank, your grief, or the fact that you've spent your entire life protecting the very people who wooed and oppose. Give you the time of day if you were standing in their way. It was a Tuesday, one of those sweltering afternoons where the asphalt feels like it's melting under your boots, and I just finished a grueling double shift coordinating a citywide task force. So I was beyond exhausted, just moving on autopilot as I pulled my black pickup into the driveway of my new home at number 58. I'd stopped at the local market to grab some steaks, a bottle of wine, and enough groceries to get me through the week, thinking I'd just fire up the grill, sit on my porch, and finally feel like I belonged somewhere. I was walking toward my front door, bags heavy in both hands, feeling the weight of the day in my shoulders when I heard this clicking sound, the sound of expensive sneakers hitting the pavement with a kind of arrogance you only find in kids who've never been told, end quote, no, end quote, in their entire lives. I didn't oppose, think much of it until a voice, sharp and dripping with that, end quote, I own this street, end quote, energy, barked out, end quote, hey you, put those bags down right now. I know exactly what you oppose. Redoing, end quote. I stopped, my keys halfway to the lock, and turned around to see a kid who cooed in and oppose. Had been more than 18, wearing a hoodie that probably cost more than my first car and a smirk that made my blood pressure spike just a tiny bit. He was standing there, arms crossed, blocking the path to my own stairs, and he tells me, end quote, my mom's been waiting for that delivery for 20 minutes and you're late, so just drop the groceries and get off her property before I make things difficult for you, end quote. I just stared at him for a second, trying to process the sheer audacity, and I said, end quote, look kid, I think you've got the wrong house and definitely the wrong person, because these are my groceries and I'm just trying to go inside, end quote. But he didn't oppose. Budge, he just laughed, this high-pitched, entitled cackle, and said, end quote, nice try, but people like you don and oppose. Live in Oak Crest. You're just the help, so hand them over or I'm calling the cops. And trust me, they don and oppose. Play around with thieves in this neighborhood, end quote. I felt that old, familiar heat rising in my chest. The kind of frustration you feel when you've spent 2 decades serving a community only to be judged by the color of your skin and the casual clothes you're wearing on your day off. But before I could even open my mouth to de-escalate, the front door of the house 2 doors down slammed open. Out marched a woman who looked like she'd been carved out of pure, concentrated entitlement. Perfectly coiffed blonde hair, a tennis outfit that had never seen a tennis court, and a phone already gripped in her hand like a weapon. This was Regina Vance, the woman I'd seen on all the HOA newsletters, the self-appointed, end quote, Queen of Oak Crest, end quote. And she didn't oppose to even look at me. She just yelled, end quote, Braxton, get away from him, you don and oppose. Know what he's carrying or what he's capable of, end quote. As she rushed over, pointing a finger so close to my face I could see her diamond ring shimmering in the sun. She didn't oppose. Asked who I was. She didn't oppose. Asked what I was doing. She just started screaming about, end quote, suspicious activity, end quote, and, end quote, unauthorized personnel, end quote, while Braxton stood there looking smug, like he'd just caught a prize-winning fish. I tried to stay calm. I really did. I kept my voice low and said, end quote, mind oppose. I'm a new neighbor. I moved in 3 days ago. I'm just trying to get my dinner into the fridge, end quote. But she let out this sharp, jagged laugh and looked around at the neighbors who were starting to peek out of their windows like it was a theater performance. End quote. New neighbor? In this zip code? Don and oppose. Be ridiculous, end quote. She sneered, her eyes scanning my truck and my faded hoodie with total disgust. End quote. I know everyone who belongs here, and you, sir, are a loiterer at best and a criminal at worst. And since you've clearly stolen my son's delivery and threatened him, I'm letting the authorities handle this, end quote. I watched her dial 911 right in front of me, weaving this elaborate lie about a, end quote, hostile intruder, end quote, who was, end quote, refusing to leave and acting violently, end quote. And honestly, for a moment, I just stood there in a daze of irony. I've spent my life being the person who answers those calls, the one who has to sift through the truth and the lies. And here I was, the end quote, target, end quote, because a woman couldn't and oppose to conceive of a world where I was her equal. The siren started wailing a few minutes later. The precinct I now commanded was efficient. I'll give them that. And as the patrol cars screeched to a halt, Regina's face lit up with this sickeningly triumphant glow, like she was about to watch a public execution. Two officers jumped out, Miller and Sarah. Good kids, both of them, and they had their hands on their belts, ready for a confrontation until they saw me. The air just left the conversation. Miller's eyes went wide. His jaw practically hit the pavement, and he instinctively straightened his back, snapping into a sharp salute before he could even think about it, mumbling, end quote, Commander Thorne? Sir? What's going on here? End quote. Regina didn't oppose to even process the, end quote, Commander, end quote. Part at first, she just started babbling, end quote, officers, thank God, arrest this man. He's been harassing my son, and he's stolen our property. He's trespassing on this gentleman's lawn, end quote. And she pointed to my own house. I'll never forget the look on Sarah's face when she turned to Regina and said, with a voice as cold as ice, end quote, Ma, and oppose. This is Commander Elias Thorne, the new head of the Criminal Investigations Division, and according to the city records we just pulled for this call, this is his residence. You're the one currently standing on his private property, end quote. The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a knife, and Regina's face went from pale to a shade of purple eye. Didn't and oppose, T-No existed, while Braxton looked like he wanted the earth to open up and swallow him whole. I just stood there, still holding my grocery bags, feeling this profound sense of weariness, and I looked at Miller and said, end quote, Officer, please start taking statements from every neighbor who saw this. I want a full report on my desk by morning because I have a feeling this ISN and oppose. The first time Mrs. Vance has used the police as her personal harassment service, end quote. And that's when the floodgates opened. Once the, end quote, Queen, end quote, lost her crown in front of everyone, the neighbors, the ones she'd been bullying for years, started coming forward. Mr. Henderson from across the street, a quiet man who'd lived there for 30 years, walked up and told the officers how Regina had tried to evict a young couple because they had, end quote, too many ethnic plants, end quote, in their yard. Then there were the Martins who'd been fined thousands of dollars for, end quote, unauthorized gatherings, end quote, that were really just family Sunday dinners. It turns out Regina had been running Oak Crest like a Victorian-era fiefdom, using the HOA bylaws to target anyone she deemed, end quote, unfit, end quote, for her vision of a perfect neighborhood. I could have pushed for every charge in the book, and believe me, filing a false police report is a serious offense that can land you in a cell. But as I sat on my porch later that night, watching Regina being escorted into her own home in tears while her son slunk away in shame, I realized that just putting her in jail wouldn't and oppose. T fixed the rod in the community. Justice ISN and oppose. T always about the handcuffs. Sometimes it's about the reconstruction. A few days later, the video a neighbor took of the whole encounter went viral, and the HOA board, finally finding their spines after years of Regina's intimidation, voted her out in a landslide. But the real shocker was Braxton. About a week after the incident, I found a letter on my porch, not an email, but a handwritten note from the kid, and it wasn't an oppose. T just a, end quote. Sorry I got caught, end quote. Note, it was raw, filled with the realization that he'd been raised to be a monster, and he didn't and oppose. T want to be that person anymore. He asked if there was any way he could make it up to me. And instead of telling him to stay away, I gave him a choice. He could face the juvenile diversion program for his part in the false report, or he could spend his entire summer working with me at the Inner City Youth Outreach Center, seeing the world through the eyes of the people he'd spent his life looking down on. He chose the Outreach Center. And let me tell you, watching that kid who used to brag about his designer hoodies, scrubbing floors, and tutoring kids who had nothing, it changed something in him. By the end of the summer, he wasn't in Oppos. T smirking anymore. He was listening. Even Regina had to go through mandatory sensitivity training and pay massive restitution to the neighbors she'd harassed. And while she'll never be my best friend, she now waves at me from a distance with a look of genuine, terrified respect. Oakcrest Manor ISN and Oppos. T perfect now, but it's a lot closer to that dream I was looking for. We had a block party last month, and for the first time in the history of this neighborhood, there were no fines, no, in quote, suspicious, in quote, calls, just people eating together. But it makes you wonder, doesn't in Oppos T it? If I hadn't in Oppos, T been who I was. If I hadn't in Oppos, T had that title and that badge to shield me. Where would I be right now? Would I be sitting in a cell? Would I have lost my job? It's a scary thought that the only difference between, in quote, neighbor, in quote, and, in quote, criminal, in quote, in some people's eyes is a piece of plastic in your wallet. So, I've got to ask you guys, have you ever dealt with a, in quote, Karen, in quote, who thought the law was their personal plaything? Do you think I was too easy on her and her son? Or is education and community service the real way we fix this kind of deep-seated prejudice? I'm curious to see what you think about how we handle people who use their privilege like a weapon. So drop a comment below and let's talk about it. Because honestly, I'm still processing the fact that I almost got arrested for buying a couple of steaks in my own driveway.